Come in close tonight and let the rest of the world fall away for a while. Pull the blanket up, let your eyes soften, and let me tell you about a kind of man that America does not really make anymore. Because the world that made him does not exist anymore either. Somewhere in the high country of what is now Wyoming. In a winter early in the 1800s, a man's life depends entirely on whether he can keep a single flame alive through the night. There is no cabin waiting for him. There is no neighbor within 100 miles. If the fire goes out, if the traps freeze shut, if the snow keeps falling, the way it has been falling for 6 days straight, he does not get a second chance. He simply does not wake up. This is not a story about adventure in the way we usually mean that word. It is a story about what it actually costs a human body and a human mind to survive a single Rocky Mountain winter completely alone. He is young, this trapper though. The mountains have already begun to age him in ways that have nothing to do with years. His beard is stiff with frost. His hands, when he pulls them from his mittens to check a trapline half buried under new snow, have gone the colour of tallow, feeling in the fingertips, long since traded away for the ability to keep working. The temperature dropped past what any thermometer of the era could reliably measure somewhere around midnight, and it has not come back up. He can hear his own breath before he feels it, a small ragged fog that hangs in the air and then vanishes over and over, the only proof most nights that he is still alive at all. His horse stands nearby with its headlow ice forming along its muzzle, and the two of them share something unspoken in that stillness. The understanding that tonight is simply a thing to be endured, not enjoyed, not remembered fondly later, around a warm hearth just survived. Hour by hour, breath by breath, he built his fire the small on purpose, tucked against a fallen log to break the wind, because a small fire that lasts is worth more than a large one that eats through his wood supply by midnight. He feeds it now with hands that barely obey him, one stick at a time, and he does not sleep so much as drift in and out of something close to sleep. Waking every 20 minutes or so out of an old learned instinct, because a man who sleeps too deeply in weather like this sometimes simply does not wake up again. There is no drama in this moment. No one is watching. There is only the fire, the dark, the cold pressing in from every direction, and one man's quiet, disciplined will to see the sun come up one more time. That is the part almost nobody tells you about the mountain men. We have inherited an idea of them as legends, buckskin and rifle and untamed freedom, striding through an empty golden wilderness with nothing but grit and a good aim between them and glory. And there is truth folded into that image. But underneath the legend is something far more human and far more remarkable than the myth ever managed to capture. These were men who chose or were driven by circumstance to live for months at a time in conditions that killed a significant number of them outright and left many of the survivors permanently marked by frostbite, old injuries, and the strange hollowed-out toughness that comes from having stared down true isolation and come out the other side. Fewer than a few thousand men ever truly lived this life at its height. A great many of them did not live to tell anyone about it. What is genuinely strange, when you start pulling at the threads of this history, is how much of it comes down to a hat. Not a rifle, not a horse, not gold, a fashionable felt hat made from the underfur of a beaver worn by gentlemen in London and Paris and New York who never once in their lives felt a Rocky Mountain wind. An entire industry, an entire brutal and beautiful chapter of the American frontier exists because European fashion demanded a particular kind of soft, water-resistant felt, and the only reliable source of it lay deep in territory that most of the men trapping it had never even seen a proper map of. It is one of those details that quietly rearranges how you understand history, that the men enduring frostbite and grisly encounters and total isolation in the northern Rockies were in a very real sense working for the vanity of men who would never leave a paved city street, And there is another detail that tends to surprise people once they hear it. Many of these trappers were not the solitary loners of popular imagination at all. A number of them married into native communities, learned languages that had never been written down, adopted survival knowledge that no European settler could have invented from scratch, and built lives that braided together two very different worlds. The version of the mountain man who exists entirely alone, entirely self-made, entirely without help is mostly a story we told ourselves later. The real version depended quietly and constantly on a people and knowledge the myth tends to leave out. Before we go further into what that world actually looked like and what it actually demanded of the men who tried to survive inside it, I want to say one small thing, if you do not mind. If this is the kind of history you've been looking for, the real version told slowly without anyone trying to rush you or shock you awake, it helps me more than you would probably guess if you take half a second to like this video and subscribe while you are here. And if you feel like it, tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what it is about a story like this one that pulled you in. I read every single one and I genuinely like knowing who is out there in the dark with me. Now, let yourself get comfortable and let's begin. Because to understand what that one man endured through that one long night in the high country, you have to understand the world that put him there in the first place. A vast, largely unmapped stretch of continent, a fur trade hungry enough to send ordinary men walking straight into it, and a way of life that would rise, burn briefly and brilliantly and vanish again within the span of a single working lifetime. The mountains that swallowed men like the one from that long cold night did not begin as mountains at all in the American imagination. They began as a blank space on a map, a stretch of the continent so vast and so unknown that early cartographers filled it in with guesswork, rumor, and hope. Beyond the muddy trading posts along the Missouri River, beyond the last cabins where a man might see another human face without traveling for weeks, the land simply opens up into something that swallows scale itself. Grass that runs for 100 miles without a single tree to break the wind. Rivers that appear on no chart because no one who has followed them has ever come back to describe them accurately. Peaks that rise so high and so sudden that early travellers describe them with a kind of religious astonishment, as though the earth itself had decided to stop being reasonable somewhere west of the Mississippi. This is the country a young United States purchases almost by accident in the first years of the 1800s, a deal struck across an ocean for reasons that have very little to do with beaver or mountains or the men who will eventually die in both. The nation buys the land without truly knowing what it has bought. It takes an expedition sent west under presidential order and led by two men whose names will outlive nearly everyone else in this story, simply to begin sketching the outline of what lies inside that purchase. What they find and what they report back does something quiet but permanent to the American imagination. It tells the country that the world does not end at the edge of the known map. It only gets stranger and richer and more dangerous. And it is the richer part that changes everything. Because somewhere in the cold, fast-moving rivers of that unmapped country in numbers that would sound almost unbelievable to anyone who has only ever seen a beaver in a nature documentary, an animal is quietly building an empire of dams and lodges that will soon become worth more pound for pound than almost anything else moving through the American economy. Beaver fur has a peculiar quality that other furs lack. Beneath the coarse outer hair lies a soft underfur made of tiny barbed strands, and when that underfur is processed correctly, it felts together into a material that holds its shape, sheds water, and takes a rich, lasting shine, unlike anything European hat makers have access to on their own continent. For decades already, the beaver populations of Europe and Eastern Russia have been trapped nearly to extinction trying to keep up with demand. By the time the American West opens up, the hunger for that felt has not slowed down. If anything, it has grown sharper, more fashionable, more essential to what a gentleman of standing is expected to wear on his head in London, in Paris, in the drawing rooms of cities. Most of the trappers who will feed this demand will never see and could not have pictured the need if they tried. It is worth sitting with that for a moment because it is one of those quiet ironies history hands you without much fanfare. The men who will spend their winters half frozen in the Rocky Mountains, who will lose fingers, lose companions, sometimes lose their own lives to accomplish it, are doing so at the far end of a supply chain, whose actual destination is a hat shop, not gold, not glory in the way we usually picture frontier ambition. A hat. The particular alchemy of fashion economics and geography that makes this possible is almost accidental, and yet it is enough to pull thousands of men over the following decades into some of the harshest country on the continent. And an entrepreneur with the genuine gift for organization sees the opportunity taking shape early and begins assembling what will become one of the largest fur trading operations in American history, stretching from outposts on the Great Lakes to trading posts along the Pacific coast. But it is a different, rougher, more improvised model of the fur trade that will actually put the men we are following into these mountains, not through the tidy hierarchy of a distant company office, but through a much more direct and much more dangerous arrangement. A newspaper advertisement placed in a Missouri paper in the early 1820s calls for enterprising young men willing to ascend the river to its source and remain there for a period of years, trapping for themselves under a shared arrangement with the men who finance the expedition. It sounds almost administrative when you read it plainly. It is in practice a call for men willing to walk directly into a landscape that has already claimed the lives of soldiers, explorers, and entire trading parties before them, with the explicit understanding that resupply, rescue, and communication with the rest of the country will happen at best once a year. What kind of man answers an advertisement like that? Some of them are younger sons with no inheritance waiting for them, and no clear path forward in the crowded cities of the East. Some are immigrants who have already crossed one ocean and see the crossing of a continent as simply the next version of the same gamble. Some are escaping debts or bad marriages, or the kind of quiet desperation that does not always make it into the history books because no one thought to write it down at the time. A number of them are of mixed heritage, sons of French-Canadian trappers and native mothers already fluent in the languages and survival knowledge that the wilderness demands, for whom this work is less a bold new adventure than simply an extension of a life they were raised inside from birth. Scholars still debate how many of the men who took up this life did so out of genuine ambition versus how many simply had nowhere better to go, and the honest answer is probably that it was rarely one or the other cleanly. Most of them likely carried some mixture of both hope and desperation braided together the way they usually are in anyone who chooses to walk toward the edge of what is known rather than stay safely behind it. What almost none of them fully understand stepping off the keelboats and onto the riverbank at the start of their first season is what the mountains will actually cost them in return for what they hope to gain. The country they are entering belongs in every meaningful sense to people who have lived there for generations already, nations with their own economies, their own alliance, their own deep and specific knowledge of how to survive winters that will kill an unprepared outsider within days. Some of these nations will become trading partners, even family, to the trappers who show genuine respect and patience. Others will see correctly that this quiet trickle of white trappers moving up their rivers is the leading edge of something much larger and much more permanent, and they will resist it with everything available to them. The trapper does not arrive into an empty wilderness, whatever the popular imagination likes to picture. He arrives into a fully inhabited world that simply does not yet appear on his employer's maps, and the gap between those two realities will define almost everything that happens to him over the coming years. There is also the matter of the animal itself, and what trapping it actually requires. A beaver is not hunted in any way that resembles chasing game across open ground. It is trapped patiently at the edge of icy streams, often before dawn, using a steel trap set just beneath the surface of water, cold enough to stop a man's heart within minutes of full immersion. The trapper wades into that water deliberately, sometimes daily, because a beaver's keen sense of smell will avoid a trap set from dry land, and the resulting toll on a human body over the course of a single season is difficult to overstate. Joints swell, feet go numb for hours at a time. Men develop chronic ailments in their 30s that would not otherwise appear until old age. The romantic image of the mountain man striding confidently through pristine wilderness leaves out this detail, almost entirely the daily grinding, bone-deep cold that comes not from a single dramatic blizzard, but from the ordinary repeated act of doing the job correctly. And underneath all of it, quietly shaping every decision these men make, sits the calendar itself, unforgiving and exact. There is a narrow window each year when the beaver's fur reaches its full winter thickness and its highest value, and that window closes just as the mountain passes begin filling with snow, deep enough to trap a man as surely as any animal. Get the timing wrong in either direction, arrive too early or linger too late, and the mountains that have fed a man all season can just as easily become the reason he never leaves them again. It is inside that narrow, dangerous window between opportunity and disaster the mountain man's entire way of life will take shape, and it is inside that same window that the story now begins to move toward the men who did more than simply survive the mountains. The ones who had come to define and ultimately be remembered by what this life demanded of them. 100 men answer that first advertisement or near enough to it, and history will later remember them collectively by a name that makes them sound more organized than they actually were in that first uncertain season. They travel up the Missouri River by keelboat, a method of transport that is itself almost absurdly labor-intensive, requiring men to walk along the bank, hauling the boat forward against the current by rope, when the wind fails them, which it does often. Disease and accident thin their numbers before they even reach the mountains properly. A boat capsizes. Fever moves through a crowded deck. The wilderness does not wait politely for the story to begin before it starts collecting its cost. The man who organizes this expedition is not by background a wilderness man himself. He is a businessman and a militia officer, more comfortable in the halls of Missouri politics than in a canoe, and his early attempts at this enterprise very nearly bankrupt him entirely. His first keelboat sinks before it even leaves port, taking a significant portion of his invested capital down with it. A different man might have walked away from the whole venture at that point, and no one would have thought less of him for it. Instead, he adjusts borrows again and tries a second time because he has come to believe something that the existing fur trade model has not yet fully grasped, which is that the old system of building permanent forts and waiting for trappers to bring pelts to you is too slow, too expensive, and too vulnerable to the exact kind of disaster that just sank his boat. What he proposes instead, and what will come to define this entire era of the American fur trade, is deceptively simple. Rather than build forts, send the men directly into the mountains to trap independently, and instead of requiring them to haul their furs hundreds of miles back to a trading post each year, bring the trading post to them. Choose a location deep in the mountains, agree on it a year in advance, and gather there once annually when the snow finally allows travel again, for a single concentrated exchange of furs for supplies, before everyone scatters back into the wilderness for another season. It is in effect moving an entire year's worth of commerce into a matter of a few frantic, crowded weeks each summer, in a location so remote that the nearest actual town might be 1,000 miles away in any direction. The first of these gatherings takes place in the summer of 1825, in a valley along the Green River in what is now Wyoming, and almost nobody involved in organizing, it seems, to fully grasp what they are creating. It begins modestly, a handful of trapping parties converging with their season's take of pelt supply wagons arriving from the east, loaded with the goods that will keep these men alive and equipped for another year. But within a few seasons, this yearly gathering grows into something closer to a temporary city drawing not only American trappers but French-Canadian voyageurs, British competitors from companies operating out of Canada, and delegations from numerous native nations who arrive both to trade and often to negotiate the increasingly complicated question of what all this foreign activity means for their own territory and way of life. What actually happens at one of these gatherings is worth sitting with for a moment because it complicates the lonely, solitary image most people carry of the mountain man. For a few short weeks each summer, after 11 months of near total isolation, hundreds of men who have not seen more than a handful of other human faces in nearly a year suddenly find themselves surrounded by more people than most of them will encounter again until the following summer. The result is, by every surviving account, something close to controlled chaos. Trading happens, certainly furs exchanged for gunpowder, lead knives, cloth, and the alcohol that trading companies bring in staggering quantities specifically because they understand its value as a commodity among men starved of ordinary pleasure. But alongside the trading comes something almost carnival-like: foot races, horse races, wrestling matches that occasionally turn genuinely dangerous, shooting competitions where men who depend on their aim for survival compete openly for pride as much as for the modest prizes on offer, music where any instrument exists to make it, marriages, some of them formalized between trappers and native women according to the customs of her people, unions that will in a number of documented cases last for decades and produce families whose descendants live in the region still. It's tempting to romanticize this entirely, and it would be dishonest to do so. The same gatherings that produce genuine camaraderie also produce violence, sometimes fatal, fueled by the alcohol that trading companies deliberately supply in quantities designed to loosen a trapper's grip on the furs he has spent a brutal year accumulating. More than one man leaves a rendezvous with a season's worth of dangerous, hard-won labor, traded away for goods worth a fraction of their actual value, drunk enough during the exchange that he barely remembers agreeing to the terms. The organizers of these gatherings are, after all, running a business and a workforce with no access to banks, no ability to store wealth over a winter, and no real alternative marketplaces from a purely commercial standpoint, a workforce that can be managed to considerable advantage. Historians studying the account books that survive from this era have found evidence suggesting that the actual profits flowing to the men doing the trapping were in many seasons considerably thinner than the mythology of independent frontier wealth would suggest. The freedom was real. The financial reward for that freedom was often far more modest than the legend implies. It's worth pausing on one detail here that tends to surprise people, because it runs so directly against the popular image of the rugged individualist trapper working entirely alone. The most successful operators of this era did not survive the mountains through solitary toughness alone. They survived through partnership, often formal, often deeply reliant on knowledge and alliance with native nations whose ancestors had spent countless generations learning exactly how to live inside these seasons without dying from them. A trapper who marries into a Shoshone or Crow family, for instance, gains access to something no amount of individual grit can substitute for generations of accumulated specific life-saving knowledge about where game moves in deep winter, which mountain passes remain viable after the first heavy snow and which become death traps, how to read a sky correctly enough to know when a storm is 3 hours away rather than 3 days. Scholars still debate how many of these unions were built on genuine mutual respect versus practical necessity on both sides, and the honest answer again is probably that most of them contained real measures of both the way most human relationships born of hardship tend to. Out of this strange, improvised, half-organized world, certain individuals begin to rise above the general anonymity of the trapping population Men whose skill, luck, or sheer capacity for endurance becomes notable even among a population where endurance is simply the baseline requirement for staying alive. One young man, barely into his 20s when he first arrives in the mountains, will within a handful of years be leading his own trapping brigades deep into the territory that no American has previously mapped, surviving an early and horrifying grizzly bear attack that leaves half his scalp torn loose from his skull, an injury that a companion reportedly sews back into place on the spot with the needle and thread out of options and out of any alternative. He will go on to become one of the first Americans to reach the California coast overland from the interior, crossing deserts that kill several of his own men from simple thirst along the way. Another trapper illiterate his entire life, yet possessing what nearly everyone who worked alongside him describes as an almost supernatural memory for terrain, will eventually build a trading post so central to westward travel that entire wagon trains of settlers years later plan their routes specifically around reaching it. Neither of these men set out in those early seasons to become legendary. They set out like nearly everyone else, answering that original newspaper advertisement, simply hoping to survive one more winter and come out the other side with enough furs to make the whole gamble worthwhile. What none of them yet know, standing in the noise and dust of that first Green River, gathering in the summer of 1825, is how brief this particular window of opportunity actually is. The system they are building, ingenious as it is, depends entirely on two things: remaining true that the beaver population can withstand the pressure being placed on it, and that fashion in the drawing rooms of London and Paris continues to demand the particular kind of felt that only their fur can produce. Neither of those things, it will turn out, can be counted on to last. But that reckoning is still some years away, and for now, in this brief golden stretch when the trapping is good and the rendezvous still feels more like celebration than survival, these men are living something close to the version of freedom that later generations will remember them for, unaware of how quickly the mountains that made them are about to start asking for everything back. The rendezvous fades into August the same way it arrives gradually, and then all at once wagons turning back east loaded with the season's furs, trapping brigades splitting off into smaller groups and vanishing back into the passes they came from, and within a week or two the valley that held hundreds of men and a small mountain of trade goods returns to something close to silence. What those men carry back into the wilderness with them, though, is not just fresh gunpowder and new traps. It is the accumulated skill of years, now refined past anything the first hopeful recruits along the Missouri River could have imagined possessing when they signed on. By the late 1820s, the trapping brigades operating through the Central Rockies represent something close to the peak of human adaptation to that particular landscape, a level of competence that took real years and real losses to build. A brigade leader by this point can read a river system the way a sailor reads weather, can look at a stretch of mountain stream and know almost instinctively where a beaver colony has been working simply from the pattern of gnawed cottonwood along the bank. He knows which passes remain open a full month later into autumn than the maps suggest, knowledge that exists nowhere on paper, passed down instead through years of trial, through companions who did not survive learning it the hard way, through careful hard-won trust in one's own accumulated instinct. This is the version of the mountain man closest to what later generations would come to mythologize, not the desperate newcomer of that first difficult winter, but the seasoned expert moving through hostile country with something approaching mastery. What is easy to miss? Looking back at this era from a comfortable distance is just how physically demanding that mastery actually was to maintain even at its height. A trapping brigade in full operation might cover 20 or more miles in a single day through terrain with no roads and often no clear trail at all. Men on horseback picking their way along game paths worn into mountainsides by elk and bighorn sheep long before any human presence arrived there. Diet during active trapping season consists overwhelmingly of meat, often astonishing quantities of it by modern standards, a man in hard physical labor at high altitude, burning calories at a rate that requires eating several pounds of meat daily simply to maintain his strength. Buffalo when it is available, deer, elk, and in leaner stretches, whatever smaller game presents itself. Fresh vegetables and fruit are essentially non-existent for months at a stretch, and the resulting nutritional gaps produce their own quiet, slow-moving danger, one that will become considerably more relevant later in this story than it seems in these good, well-fed years. There is a detail here that tends to genuinely surprise people the first time they hear it because it runs against every popular image of frontier cuisine. Among trappers, the tail of the beaver roasted slowly over open coals until the outer skin blisters and peels away is considered something close to a delicacy, rich and fatty in a way that a body craving calories after weeks of leaner meat responds to almost immediately. Several surviving accounts from trappers and the occasional visiting naturalist describe it with something bordering on genuine affection, a rare small luxury carved out of an otherwise unforgiving diet. It is a small thing, but it says something true about how people build pockets of pleasure and normalcy, even inside genuinely brutal circumstances, an instinct that shows up again and again throughout this particular history. The brigades themselves operate with a structure that owes more to necessity than to any formal military model, though the language used to describe them sometimes borrows from it. A brigade leader called a bouchouet by the men who serve under him, a word evolved from the French for a company officer holds authority that is respected, rather than simply imposed, because in country this unforgiving a poor decision from an incompetent leader gets men killed with brutal efficiency. Beneath him work free trappers who own their own equipment and furs outright, and essentially contract their skill and labour to the brigade for the season and engages employed men working directly for a wage and the promise of supplies whose furs belong to the company that hired them rather than to themselves. The distinction matters enormously to the men living it, shaping everything from how much risk a man is willing to take on a given trap line to how bitterly he negotiates at the rendezvous. Each summer, though from a distance of 2 centuries both groups endured essentially the same physical dangers regardless of which side of that arrangement they occupied. It is during this height of the trade that some of the era's most significant geographic discoveries happen almost entirely as an accidental byproduct of men simply looking for beaver rather than looking for fame or scientific recognition. One trapper wintering in territory previously unexplored by any American comes upon a vast, silent, undrinkable lake in what is now Utah. Its water so saturated with salt that nothing lives in it, and a man floats on its surface without effort, an image so strange that when word of it eventually reaches the East, some newspapers assume it is simply a tall tale invented around a rendezvous campfire. It is not. The lake is real, and its discovery credited to a trapper working essentially alone in pursuit of beaver rather than geography, quietly reshapes the maps of the American West years before any formal government survey confirms what he already knows firsthand. Historians still debate the precise circumstances and timing of exactly how and when this discovery reached wider recognition, since multiple trappers may have encountered the lake independently within a similar span of years, each unaware that others had already seen it. The ordinary confusion of an era with no reliable way to quickly share information across such enormous distances. The same pattern repeats itself again and again through these years. Mountain passes, river sources, entire valley systems discovered, not by expeditions specifically funded and equipped to explore, but by exhausted, focused men simply trying to find the next stretch of beaver-rich water before the season closes. A pass through the central Rockies gentle enough for loaded wagons to eventually cross, one that will later carry tens of thousands of settlers westward along what becomes one of the most significant overland routes in American history, is identified and used by trapping brigades years before any wagon train attempts it, the trappers moving through it purely as a practical shortcut between trapping grounds with no sense at all that they are quietly mapping the future path of an entire nation's westward expansion. And yet for all this expanding mastery, all this accumulated skill and growing knowledge of the landscape, something remains true across every single season of this era that no amount of experience ever fully eliminates. Does a man's skill actually protect him from these mountains, or does it simply change the shape of how they eventually take their toll? A veteran trapper with a decade of experience behind him still loses fingers to frostbite, still drowns crossing a river swollen with spring melt that looked calm from the bank, still on occasion simply vanishes a man who rides out from camp one morning and is never seen again by anyone who can offer a clear account of what became of him. His absence noted, mourned briefly by companions who cannot afford to search for long, and then folded quietly into the ordinary rhythm of a life where this kind of loss, while never routine exactly, is never entirely unexpected either. Because underneath the genuine skill, underneath the accumulated woodcraft and river knowledge and hard-won mastery of this landscape, the mountains themselves have not actually softened at all. They have simply been learned the way a man might learn to live alongside something dangerous without ever fully taming it. And as these years of relative abundance continue, as brigades push further into country even the most experienced trappers have not yet mapped, they are moving steadily closer to territory where their hard-earned skill will matter less than it ever has before, and where the delicate temporary balance that has allowed this entire way of life to flourish is already quietly and almost invisibly beginning to come apart. There is a particular kind of danger that does not announce itself in advance, and the trapping brigades of the 1820s and 30s come to know this one intimately, because it does not live in the weather or the terrain at all, but in the animal. They share these mountains with an animal capable of ending a man's life in under a minute despite every ounce of skill he has spent years accumulating. The grizzly bear that roams this landscape in the early 19th century bears little resemblance to the more cautious human-avoidant population that survives in isolated pockets of the modern West. This is an animal that has had almost no meaningful contact with firearms, no generational memory of humans as a threat to be avoided, and a natural range that still stretches unbroken across the plains and mountains in numbers that would astonish anyone familiar only with today's dramatically reduced population. Trappers moving through beaver country encounter these animals constantly at close range, often while wading through the very streams where the bears themselves come to fish, and the resulting collisions between man and animal produce some of the most harrowing survival accounts to come out of this entire era. One of these accounts belongs to a trapper whose name will eventually become inseparable from the phrase used to describe true, almost unbelievable endurance. Scouting ahead of his party along a tributary of the Missouri, he startles a female grizzly protecting her cubs at close range, a combination of circumstances that offers almost no margin for escape. The bear is on him before his companions can reach him, and by the time they manage to drive the animal off, they find him alive, but barely. His scalp torn loose, deep gashes opened across his back and chest, one leg broken. Convinced that he cannot possibly survive such injuries this far from any actual medical care, and unable to continue carrying him at the pace, their situation demands his own party makes a decision that reveals something honest and unglamorous about the moral calculus of frontier survival. 2 men are left behind with him, promised extra pay to stay until he dies and give him a proper burial, while the rest of the brigade moves on, unable to risk further exposure, waiting for an outcome that seems to everyone present essentially certain. The 2 men left behind wait several days. The wounded trapper does not die, though he also does not regain enough strength to travel, and eventually, with hostile territory nearby and their own supplies running low, they make the decision to leave as well, taking his rifle and equipment with them and reporting back to the rest of the brigade that he has died. Whether from genuine belief or simple convenience, the historical record cannot say with certainty. What they leave behind is a man with no weapon, no proper supplies, and injuries severe enough that infection alone should have finished what the bear started, alone in territory that offers no clear path back to any form of help. What happens next has become, over the 2 centuries since, one of the most retold stories to come out of the entire fur trade era. And it is worth being honest about the fact that some of the specific details have likely been shaped and reshaped by generations of retelling into something slightly larger than strict documentation can fully confirm. Scholars still debate exactly how much of the traditional account reflects precise historical fact versus the natural embellishment that inevitably attaches itself to a story this remarkable as it passes from campfire to campfire over the following decades. What does appear consistently across the earlier surviving versions is this: the man does not die. Unable to walk, he crawls, dragging his broken leg behind him, covering what several accounts estimate at roughly 200 miles of open, hostile country over a period of weeks, surviving on wild berries, on the marrow of animal bones left behind by wolves, on whatever his battered, half-healed body can manage to extract from a landscape that offers almost nothing freely. At one point, according to the accounts that survive, he allows maggots to work in his untreated wounds, a practice that modern medicine would later recognize as genuinely effective at removing dead infected tissue. Whether he understood the underlying reason or simply had no better option available to him, he survives. He eventually reaches a trading post, and by most accounts of what follows, chooses not to seek violent retribution against the men who left him for dead, though the emotional weight of what happened between them afterward is something no surviving document can fully capture with certainty. It would be tempting to treat this story as simply exceptional, a single extraordinary case that stands apart from the ordinary rhythm of mountain life. But the honest truth, and one that deserves to be said plainly rather than softened, is that grisly encounters of some severity happen with genuine regularity throughout this era. And this particular trapper's survival is remarkable, specifically because most men who suffer wounds anywhere close to this severe simply do not live to tell about it afterward. For every account passed down and retold, there are almost certainly others lost entirely, men whose brigades report only that they did not return from a scouting trip with no surviving witness able to say exactly what happened to them out there. What is it, one might reasonably wonder, that draws men back into country capable of this after witnessing or hearing about an encounter like this one? The honest answer seems to be less about courage in any simple sense and more about the particular psychology that develops in men who have already accepted on some fundamental level that this landscape operates by its own rules, regardless of how carefully they behave within it. A trapper who has spent several seasons in this country comes to hold 2 things simultaneously that might otherwise seem contradictory: genuine respect bordering on reverence for the danger these mountains represent, and a kind of practiced necessary calm about that same danger that allows him to keep working, keep trapping, keep wading into cold water at dawn despite knowing exactly what waits occasionally in the willows along the bank. The grizzly, though formidable and genuinely feared, is far from the only danger reshaping the calculus of this life as the 1820s give way to the 1830s. Relations with certain native nations, complicated from the very beginning by competing claims to the same territory and the same resources, grow considerably more strained as the volume of trapping activity increases, and as some nations come to understand with growing clarity exactly what this steady influx of outsiders ultimately signals about their own future on this land. Trading posts are attacked, trapping parties are ambushed in country where a warning shout carries no farther than the nearest ridgeline. The evidence surrounding many of these individual conflicts remains genuinely incomplete, coloured heavily by accounts written almost entirely from the perspective of the trapping companies and the settlers who came after them. And any honest telling of this history has to hold space for the reality that we are often hearing only one side of what were in truth deeply layered conflicts over land resources and survival on both sides of every encounter. What all of this means taken together, the bears, the increasingly dangerous territorial tensions, the sheer accumulated physical toll of years spent in this work, is that the golden window of this particular way of life, however real and however remarkable while it lasts, was never built to last indefinitely. The mountains that made these men, that shaped their skill and their endurance, and the particular quiet toughness that would eventually become their legend, are the same mountains already beginning in small and scattered ways that no single trapper can yet see clearly from the middle of it to call in the debt that a life like this one always eventually comes due. By the early 1830s, something has begun shifting in the character of this trade that the men living inside it can feel more clearly than they can always name a change. Less like a single dramatic event and more like a tide slowly turning beneath a ship whose crew is too busy with daily work to notice the current has reversed. The single organisation has by this point given way to fierce and sometimes genuinely vicious competition. A rival company formed by men who once worked under the original enterprise and have since struck out to challenge it directly begins pushing hard into the same mountain valleys, driving up the price paid for supplies, driving down the price paid for furs, and in more than a few documented instances, resorting to tactics that go well beyond ordinary business rivalry. Trappers loyal to one company are known to sabotage the traps of another. Native allies are courted aggressively by both sides sometimes, with promises that directly contradict each other. At least one confrontation between rival brigades escalates to actual gunfire men who share a common language, a common trade, and often a common history, working together in earlier seasons now, aiming rifles at one another over territorial claims to a beaver stream. It is a strange and quietly tragic detail of this era that some of the deadliest violence trappers face in these years comes not from bears or from hostile resistance, but from each other businessmen, an ocean away making decisions that translate on the ground into men who once shared a campfire now treating one another as obstacles to be removed. Underneath this competition sits a mathematical problem that none of the companies fighting over these mountains seem willing to fully confront, though the evidence for it accumulates steadily with each passing season. A beaver colony left undisturbed can sustain modest trapping, more or less indefinitely, the animals reproducing quickly enough to replace what is taken. But the sheer volume of trapping activity by the early 1830s, with multiple competing companies and hundreds of independent trappers all working the same limited network of mountain streams, begins to outpace what these populations can naturally replace. Streams that produced dozens of prime pelts a few seasons earlier now yield a fraction of that number. Brigades find themselves ranging farther and farther from established routes, pushing into increasingly remote and increasingly dangerous territory, simply to find beaver colonies that have not yet been thinned by the competition. The mountains are not. It turns out an infinite resource, however vast they appeared to that first hopeful 100 men travelling upriver a decade earlier. They are simply large enough that the limit was not visible right away. There is a particular kind of quiet honesty required to say this plainly, rather than dress it up, because it complicates the romantic version of this story that later generations would come to prefer. The very success of the rendezvous system, the very efficiency that made this trade so profitable and drew so many men into these mountains, contains within it the mechanism of its own eventual exhaustion. It is not an outside force that finally breaks this way of life. It is in significant parts the trade consuming its own foundation faster than that foundation can regenerate a pattern that historians studying resource economics across many different eras and industries would likely recognize as depressingly familiar, though the trappers living through it in the 1830s have no such wider historical perspective available to comfort or warn them. Layered on top of this slow ecological unravelling is a second sharper danger one that has been building for years, and now reaches a genuine crisis point in the relationship between American trappers and certain native nations whose territory this trade depends on crossing. Among the various nations of the northern plains and mountains, the Blackfeet Confederacy in particular has by this point developed a deep and well-founded hostility toward American trapping parties specifically, distinct from their relationships with British and French-Canadian traders operating in the same general region. Some of this hostility traces back to a violent encounter years earlier, during the original expedition that first mapped this territory for the United States government, a clash that left members of a Blackfeet party dead at the hands of the expedition's own men, an event that the Blackfeet understandably did not forget or forgive simply because the Americans who caused it moved on and considered the matter closed. One trapper's experience captures the resulting danger with particular clarity. A man who had travelled west, originally, as part of that same mapping expedition and stayed on afterward to try his hand at independent trapping, captured by a Blackfeet party while scouting alone along a river. He is stripped of his weapons and clothing, and according to the account that survives, given a chance to run, told he will be allowed to live if he can outdistance his pursuers across open ground, a version of a hunt that gives him at least the shadow of a fighting chance rather than simple execution. What follows is several miles of desperate barefoot flight across terrain, studded with prickly pear cactus, the trapper's feet and legs torn open with every stride while armed men on his trail close the distance behind him. He manages through some combination of genuine speed, sheer desperation, and what can only be described as considerable luck to outrun all but one of his pursuers, turning at the critical moment to wrestle that final man's spear away from him and use it against him before continuing on, alone, injured and unarmed for several more days through hostile territory, until he finally reaches the safety of a trading post. Scholars still debate certain specific details of this particular account, since it comes down to us largely through the trapper's own later retelling and the retellings of those who heard it from him, but the broader pattern it represents, escalating an often lethal conflict between American trappers and nations whose territory and resources were being steadily consumed by this trade, is confirmed across numerous other less individually dramatic incidents from the same years. What does it actually mean, one might reasonably ask, for a trapper to work inside a landscape where the same river valley that offers his livelihood might also on any given day offer his death at the hands of people with every legitimate reason to see him as an invader? The honest answer is that it means living with a form of chronic background tension that never fully resolves in either direction. Not the acute terror of any single dramatic encounter, but a low, constant awareness that shapes nearly every decision, which trails to take, which camps to make visible, and which to keep hidden. How many armed companions to travel with even on routine trapping rounds? It is worth remembering honestly that this tension existed because American trappers were operating inside territory that did not belong to them. In any sense, the Blackfeet or other resisting nations would have recognized as legitimate whatever legal or economic framework the fur companies back east preferred to imagine governed these mountains. This was not simply an unfortunate hazard of frontier work. It was the direct and predictable consequence of one people's economic ambition moving uninvited through land another people had lived on and depended on for many generations before any keelboat first pushed up the Missouri River. The combined weight of these pressures, thinning beaver populations, Brutal competition between rival companies and escalating violence with nations determined to defend their territory begins by the mid-1830s to change the character of the rendezvous itself in ways that the men attending it can feel, even if the underlying economics remain somewhat abstract to them. The gatherings grow larger in some years, drawing more curious observers and even the occasional wealthy tourist from the East eager to witness this famous frontier spectacle firsthand, and yet the actual profitability for the ordinary trapper, the man doing the freezing and the wading and the risking, grows steadily thinner. Furs that commanded a strong price a decade earlier now sell for considerably less, even as the cost of the supplies a trapper depends on for survival continues climbing, the companies controlling both ends of that exchange and adjusting the terms increasingly in their own favour as competition for a shrinking resource intensifies. A man can work just as hard, endure just as much, and come away from a season with meaningfully less to show for it than his counterpart would have earned trapping the very same streams only a handful of years before. And quietly, almost invisibly against the backdrop of all this immediate ground-level struggle, something else is happening, thousands of miles away, that none of these men, focused entirely on the daily business of survival, have any real way of perceiving yet. In the fashion centres of Europe, a new material is beginning to appear in gentlemen's hat silk, processed in a manner that produces a shine and a lightness that increasingly appeals to changing tastes among the very class of customers whose demand for beaver felt originally set this entire chapter of American history into motion. It is a small shift at first, barely noticeable, the kind of change that a trapper, standing waist-deep in a freezing Rocky Mountain stream in 1835, has absolutely no reason to know is even occurring, let alone any reason to suspect it will eventually matter more to his own fate than any grizzly bear or any hostile encounter he has yet survived. The mountains themselves have not changed. The work remains exactly as demanding, exactly as dangerous, exactly as capable of taking a man's life on any given morning, as it has been since that first hopeful hundred set out from Missouri over a decade earlier. But underneath the surface of this still vibrant, still dangerous, still genuinely remarkable way of life, the ground has already begun quietly and from multiple directions at once to shift beneath the feet of men who have every reason to believe this world will simply continue as it has, unaware of how little time actually remains before the particular brutal, brilliant chapter of American history they are living through reaches the point from which there will be no returning. Winter, when it finally arrives in earnest in these mountains, does not arrive as a single dramatic storm so much as a slow, patient closing of every door at once. And it is worth spending real time here, because everything the earlier seasons built, the skill, the knowledge, the hard-won mastery of this landscape, gets tested against a version of cold that very few people alive today in a world of heated buildings and insulated clothing have ever genuinely had to face without any real means of escape. A trapper who chooses, or is forced by the circumstance, to overwinter in the mountains rather than retreat to lower ground, faces a season that typically stretches from the first heavy snows of late autumn through the thaw, that does not reliably arrive until April or even May, at higher elevations a span of 5 or 6 months, during which travel becomes genuinely dangerous or entirely impossible for weeks at a stretch, during which the sun at these latitudes and elevations offers barely 9 hours of weak daylight at its lowest point, and during which temperatures at the higher camps regularly fall to levels that modern weather services would issue emergency warnings over well below what any unprotected human body can tolerate for more than a matter of minutes. The body itself, under this kind of sustained assault, begins to fail in a predictable sequence that the trappers of this era came to know intimately, whether or not they understood the underlying physiology driving it. Frostbite begins at the extremities, fingers and toes first, then ears and nose, the body's circulatory system making a ruthless but genuinely life-preserving calculation withdrawing warm blood from the periphery to protect the core organs that keep a person alive. The skin at the affected areas grows pale, then hard, then eventually black as the tissue dies outright, and a trapper working in these conditions across multiple seasons very often carries the visible evidence for the rest of his life. Missing fingertips, a nose reduced to little more than a scarred nub ears that have lost their outer shape entirely. It was common enough, in fact, that a man missing several fingers to old frostbite barely drew a second glance at a rendezvous gathering. Simply one more unremarkable mark of a life lived this way. Beyond frostbite waits the slower, quieter, and in many ways more insidious danger of nutritional collapse. The diet that sustained a trapper so well during the active trapping season, heavy on fresh meat, becomes considerably harder to maintain through a hard winter. When game grows scarce, moves to lower elevations, or becomes simply too difficult to track and kill through deep snow. Meat alone. Moreover, particularly the leaner cuts of wild game available in winter cannot fully prevent a specific and genuinely devastating deficiency that develops when a body goes for extended periods without any source of vitamin C, a nutrient present in fresh fruit and vegetables that are entirely unavailable for months on end in a Rocky Mountain winter camp. Scurvy, a condition more commonly associated in popular memory with sailors on long ocean voyages, appears with real regularity among overwintering trappers, and more devastatingly, among expedition parties caught unprepared in the mountains during harsh seasons. The symptoms progress with a cruelty that makes the earlier stages easy to dismiss. First, simple fatigue and aching joints, easily blamed on the ordinary exhaustion of winter survival. Then bleeding, swollen gums, old wounds and scars reopening spontaneously as the body's ability to maintain its own connective tissue breaks down, and in advanced cases, teeth loosening and falling out entirely, a slow, grinding deterioration that a man might not even recognize for what it is until it has already progressed dangerously far. It is worth pausing honestly on this detail, because it complicates any simple story about mountain men being defeated primarily by dramatic violent encounters, bears and hostile raids and blizzards. The evidence surviving from this era, drawn from trapper journals, company records, and the accounts of the occasional visiting physician or naturalist who passed through these camps, suggests that slow, unglamorous causes malnutrition exposure, and the various illnesses that flourish in bodies weakened by both likely killed at least as many men over the course of this era as any single dramatic cause, though the historical record on this particular point remains genuinely difficult to pin down with precision, since so many individual deaths in this period went entirely undocumented beyond a brief second-hand mention in a companion's later recollection, if that. There is a particular kind of isolation, too, that deserves to be named honestly, because it shaped the psychological experience of this life every bit as much as the physical demands did. A trapper wintering alone or with only one or two companions in a camp that might be 100 miles or more from the nearest other human settlement experiences a form of sustained solitude that very few people in the modern world, saturated as it is with constant contact and communication, can easily imagine from the inside. Weeks pass without the sound of another unfamiliar human voice. Surviving journals from this era, sparse and practical as most of them are, occasionally offer a brief unguarded glimpse into what this isolation actually did to a man's inner life. A passage noting simple aching gratitude at the arrival of a single unexpected visitor after a long stretch of silence, or a line reflecting with quiet, unadorned honesty on how strange and disorienting it becomes to go so long without hearing one's own native language spoken aloud by anyone but oneself. What did a man actually think about alone in a small shelter through the long dark of a mountain winter night, with nothing but a low fire, and his own thoughts for company across the many silent hours between sunset and a late winter dawn? The honest answer is that we know less about this than we might wish. because the men living this life were almost without exception practical rather than introspective by both temperament and necessity, and the journals that survive tend to record weather, game sightings, and trap counts far more consistently than they record anything resembling emotional reflection. What survives instead is inference drawn from the outward evidence, the way certain trappers after years of this life grew notably quiet and withdrawn, even during the social abundance of a summer rendezvous, the way others seemed to actively seek out company and conversation with an almost desperate eagerness after a long, isolated winter. Small behavioral traces that hint at an inner cost the men themselves rarely, if ever, put directly into words. Shelter itself through these months is a matter of genuine engineering ingenuity, born entirely out of necessity. A winter camp is typically established in a sheltered valley or canyon chosen specifically for protection from prevailing winds, and for proximity to both water and a stand of timber substantial enough to provide fuel across an entire season, since a single winter camp might consume an almost unbelievable volume of firewood. Some estimates suggesting a well-maintained fire through a genuinely cold Rocky Mountain winter could require several cords of wood, meaning that a meaningful portion of every short winter day gets spent simply on the unglamorous, exhausting labor of cutting and hauling fuel labor that itself carries real risk, since an axe injury or a fall while dragging timber through deep snow far from any medical care whatsoever could prove just as fatal as any grisly encounter. Horses essential to virtually every aspect of a trapper's mobility and livelihood face their own brutal winter mathematics. Grass buried under feet of snow becomes essentially inaccessible, and a trapper wintering in place must either move his animals to a lower elevation valley, where forage remains available itself, a task requiring careful judgment about timing and route, or resign himself to watching his horses grow gradually weaker across the season on whatever meagre browse he can provide them, sometimes reduced to stripping bark from cottonwood trees, to keep starving animals alive through the worst stretches. The loss of horses in a bad winter was not merely an inconvenience. A trapper without functional horses in this landscape was, in the most literal sense, a man whose entire mobility and ability to reach help in an emergency had been stripped away, and more than one winter's hardship compounded itself precisely this way. A hard season weakening the horses, weakened horses, limiting a man's options and limited options, turning what might have been a survivable difficulty into something considerably more dangerous. And then there is the specific quiet horror of genuine sustained starvation, which visited certain trapping parties and expeditions in this era, with the severity that the surviving accounts describe in language notably restrained compared to what the circumstances would seem to warrant, as though the men who lived through it and later wrote it down could only bring themselves to record the bare facts, rather than dwell on what those facts actually felt like from the inside. One well-documented expedition caught in an unusually harsh mountain winter, with supplies exhausted and game entirely absent for a devastating stretch of weeks, resorted eventually to eating the leather of their own moccasins and equipment softened over a fire into something barely chewable, purely for the small measure of nutrition the boiled hide could offer a body otherwise consuming itself. Several men in this same expedition did not survive the ordeal, and the specific circumstances surrounding certain individual deaths within that party remain genuinely disputed among historians who have studied the surviving fragmentary accounts, since the men who did survive offered varying and occasionally conflicting versions of exactly what became of their weakest companions during the worst stretch of that particular winter. A gap in the record that later writers have filled with considerably more certainty than the actual primary sources support. It would be easy telling this part of the story to lean into the darkest edges of what desperation drove some of these men toward in their most extreme moments, and a different kind of channel might choose to dwell there. But the truth this history actually asks us to sit with is quieter, and in its own way more affecting than any single gruesome detail could be. It is simply this: ordinary men, not exceptional in any particular way before they came west, endured months of cold isolation, hunger and physical deterioration that would break most people within days, not because they were uniquely tough by some inborn quality, but because the alternative quite literally was death, and something in the human capacity for endurance, when genuinely tested against no other option, proves itself again and again throughout this history to run considerably deeper than most of us, safe and warm in our own lives, ever have reason to discover about ourselves. By the time spring finally arrives late and grudging at these elevations, the men who survive a hard winter emerge from their camps changed in ways both visible and invisible. Thinner, scarred, sometimes missing fingers or toes, they entered the season still possessing but also carrying something else. A particular hard-earned calm that comes only from having faced the absolute limit of what a body and a mind can endure, and having against real odds come out the other side of it still breathing. What none of them yet know, emerging, blinking and gaunt into the first thaw, is that the mountains which nearly killed them this past winter are in their own slow, patient way already preparing to release their grip on these men's lives entirely, not through any single dramatic final winter, but through forces moving quietly in ledgers and fashion houses, thousands of miles away. Forces that are about to make the very question of surviving another season in this wilderness matter far less than any of them could yet imagine. What we actually know about this world in the end comes down to a surprisingly thin and fragile thread of evidence. And it is worth pausing here to look honestly at where this entire history actually comes from, because the answer says almost as much about the limits of what we can know as it does about the men themselves. Unlike the sweeping military campaigns and royal courts that dominate so much of recorded history, the Mountain Man era left behind almost no official record in the way we usually think of historical documentation. Most of the men who lived this life could read only haltingly of it all, and fewer still had any habit or inclination toward writing things down for their own sake. What survives instead comes from a small handful of sources, each with its own particular gaps and biases that any honest telling of this history has to acknowledge rather than smooth over. The most direct evidence comes from the company ledgers themselves, the account books kept by the fur trading businesses that financed these expeditions, recording who owed what, whose furs sold for how much, what supplies were advanced against next season's take. These documents were never meant to tell a human story. They were meant to track profit and loss, and yet historians poring over them in the decades since have found that they quietly reveal a great deal anyway. The names of men otherwise lost entirely to the record, the shape of debts that trapped some individuals in a cycle of dependency on the company that supplied them, the years in which a particular brigade's returns dropped sharply enough to suggest hardship that no surviving letter or journal ever directly describes. A ledger entry noting simply that a certain trapper's account was closed and his remaining debt written off can be, upon closer inspections, the only surviving record that a man died in the mountains that season, his actual death never described anywhere else. His name reduced finally to a single administrative notation in a company's book of accounts. Beyond the ledgers sit the journals, and here the picture grows considerably richer, though still narrower than we might wish. A small number of literate men involved in this trade company. Clerks, occasional educated adventurers who came west for a season or two out of curiosity, and a handful of the trappers themselves kept journals of varying detail and consistency, and these documents remain the single richest window we have into the daily texture of this life. Yet even here, a meaningful gap exists between what these journals record and what the fuller human experience must actually have contained. Trail conditions where their game counts and the practical business of trapping fill page after page with methodical, almost bureaucratic consistency, while the inner emotional life of the men keeping these records appears only in scattered incidental fragments. A brief line here about loneliness, a passing mention there of grief following a companion's death, offered without elaboration and then immediately followed by the next day's entry about trap counts and weather, as though the writer himself was not entirely comfortable lingering on anything beyond the practical. Then there are the accounts written, considerably later memoirs and interviews conducted with the small number of former trappers who lived long enough, decades afterward, to be sought out by curious historians and journalists eager to preserve first-hand testimony before this generation vanished entirely. These late-life recollections are genuinely valuable offering, detail and texture no contemporary document captured, but they also carry an inherent and unavoidable problem that any careful historian has to weigh honestly. Memory reshapes itself over decades, particularly memory of one's own youth and a man recounting his mountain years as an old man in the 1880s or 90s. Speaking to an audience already hungry for frontier legend and adventure was almost certainly, whether consciously or not, shaping his account to fit the expectations of listeners who wanted heroism and drama rather than the more mundane, grinding reality of cold feet and monotonous trap-checking that likely filled the actual majority of his working days. The evidence remains incomplete in a very particular way here, not because the events themselves are in serious doubt, but because the emotional and psychological texture surrounding them has almost certainly been smoothed, polished, and occasionally embellished by the passage of so many years, and by the particular expectations of a later audience. Physical evidence adds another quite different layer to what we know in archaeological work conducted at former trading post sites and known rendezvous locations over the past several decades has in a number of cases confirmed or complicated details that the written record left ambiguous. Excavations at the site of one of the more significant trading posts of this era have recovered thousands of individual artifacts, trade beads, gun parts, buttons, fragments of glass bottles, animal bones showing clear evidence of butchering patterns and taken together. This physical record offers something the written accounts largely cannot: a picture of daily material life built not from what someone chose to write down, but from what people actually used, discarded and left behind without any intention of it ever being examined. Bone analysis from several sites, for instance, has allowed researchers to reconstruct dietary patterns with a level of precision no journal entry provides, confirming the heavy reliance on the large game meat that period accounts describe, while also revealing through subtle chemical signatures preserved in preserved skeletal remains in certain documented cases evidence of the nutritional stress and periodic scarcity that the more triumphant later memoirs tend to downplay in favour of a more heroic narrative. There is a particular kind of quiet, unglamorous historical detective work happening in this field even now, decades after the last man who actually lived this life has died, and one detail from that ongoing research tends to genuinely surprise people when they hear it for the first time. For a very long time, the popular understanding of where certain rendezvous gatherings actually took place rested on second-hand descriptions and rough period maps, location details that later historians and simply accepted and repeated without close scrutiny, only through careful, patient archaeological survey work searching for the specific pattern of trade goods and camp debris that a temporary settlement of this scale would have left behind have researchers in more recent years been able to confirm, or in at least one notable instance meaningfully correct, the accepted location of a historic gathering site, moving it to a spot somewhat different from where popular tradition had long assumed it stood. It is a small correction in the larger scope of this history, but it says something important and worth sitting with, that even a relatively well-documented chapter of American history, like this one, still contains genuine ongoing uncertainty at the level of basic concrete fact uncertainty that continues slowly to be refined and revised as new evidence comes to light. What does it actually mean? One might reasonably wonder that so much of what we think we know about this era rests on such a narrow and imperfect foundation of evidence. It does not mean the broad outline of this history is somehow in doubt. The existence of the trade, the rendezvous system, the brutal physical demands these men faced. All of this is confirmed across multiple independent lines of evidence that corroborate one another consistently. What it does mean is that the specific, individual human texture of this history, the particular thoughts and feelings and daily inner experience of any one trapper, on any one ordinary evening in his winter camp, remains genuinely and permanently out of reach in a way that no amount of future archaeological work or archival discovery is ever likely to fully recover. We can know with real confidence what these men did. We can know with somewhat less confidence roughly how they did it and under what conditions. What we know least of all, and what we have to be honest about not knowing, is who they actually were on the inside, moment to moment, through the long private hours that no ledger recorded and no later memoir quite managed to capture honestly. This gap in the record has, over the nearly 2 centuries since this era ended, been filled by something else, entirely popular imagination. And it is worth turning toward that gap directly, because the space between what the evidence actually shows and what popular memory eventually built on top of it turns out to be one of the more genuinely fascinating threads running through this entire history. A thread that reveals as much about the generations who told and retold these stories afterward as it does about the men who actually lived them. The image most people carry today of a mountain man, buckskin fringed and rifle in hand, striding alone and unbothered through an untouched wilderness, did not emerge from the men themselves, nor primarily from the sparse documentary record that history actually left behind. It emerged in large part from writers, artists, and eventually filmmakers working decades and even centuries after the fact, shaping raw historical material into something that served the needs and appetites of the audiences they were writing for. And the resulting gap between that popular figure and the documented reality is genuinely wide enough to be worth walking through carefully. One of the earliest and most influential shapers of this myth was not a trapper at all, but a novelist writing adventure fiction for an Eastern American readership, hungry for tales of frontier daring, publishing stories in the middle decades of the 1800s that borrowed real names and real locations from the fur trade era, while freely inventing dialogue, romance, and dramatic incident that no surviving primary source supports. These stories sold in enormous numbers, reaching readers who would never travel anywhere near the actual Rocky Mountains, and for many of those readers, this fictionalized version became in practice their entire understanding of what mountain men actually were. It is worth sitting honestly with how much of our inherited cultural memory of any historical era arrives this way, filtered through commercial storytelling, created for entertainment rather than accuracy. And the mountain man era is a particularly clear example of just how far that filtering process can travel from its original source material. The visual image compounds this further. A number of the paintings and illustrations that shape the popular imagination of this era, including some produced by artists who never actually travelled west or who visited only briefly during the tamer, more settled later years of American expansion, tend toward a kind of composed theatrical grandeur. A lone trapper posed heroically against a dramatic mountain backdrop. Clean buckskin confident stance, an image built for gallery walls and magazine illustrations, rather than drawn from careful observation of an exhausted, frostbitten man 3 months into a hard winter. Compare this to the handful of surviving descriptions written by people who actually encountered trappers in the field, which speak instead of matted, unwashed hair, clothing stiff with grease and old blood from repeated butchering. A general physical state that visiting travellers from the East, unaccustomed to frontier conditions, sometimes describe with open, undisguised distaste rather than admiration. The real mountain man, by most contemporary accounts, was considerably less picturesque than the version that would eventually adorn calendars and dime novel covers. Perhaps the most significant distortion, though, concerns the question of solitude itself, the very idea baked into the popular archetype that defines a mountain man, primarily by his aloneness, his self-sufficiency, his existence apart from any community or dependency. The evidence tells a genuinely more complicated and in many ways more interesting story. A significant number of the men who spent years in this trade were not solitary at all in any meaningful sense. They lived within extended kinship networks that included native wives, mixed heritage children, and long-standing alliances with specific native families and bands that provided exactly the kind of support, knowledge, and material assistance that made survival in this landscape possible in the first place. Historians of this period have increasingly emphasized that the popular image of the self-reliant loner obscures a reality in which interdependence, not individual toughness alone, was very often the actual determining factor between a trapper who survived his years in the mountains and one who did not. This raises an honest question worth sitting with directly. If interdependence and native alliance were this central to survival, why does the popular myth so consistently strip that reality out and replace it with a figure defined almost entirely by solitary self-sufficiency? The most plausible answer, though scholars still debate the precise cultural mechanics of it, seems to lie less in anything about the trappers themselves and more in what later generations of American audiences needed this story to mean. A frontier myth built around a lone white man conquering an empty wilderness through individual grit fit comfortably within a much larger 19th and early 20th century American narrative about westward expansion as a story of solitary conquest and manifest destiny. A narrative that had very little use for the messier, more accurate reality of a multiracial interdependent frontier economy built substantially on native knowledge, native marriage alliances, and native goodwill. The myth was not simply a harmless simplification, it performed real cultural work, quietly erasing the central role native peoples played in this history, and replacing it with a story more flattering to the audience consuming it. There is a similarly telling gap around the question of violence and conflict, one that deserves the same honest treatment. Popular retellings of this era, especially those produced through much of the 20th century, tend to frame conflicts between trappers and native nations in simple one-directional terms. Brave frontiersmen defending themselves against unprovoked hostility. The documentary and archaeological evidence that survives paints a considerably more layered picture, one in which an American trapping activity itself represented an ongoing cumulative territorial and resource intrusion into land that native nations had every rational reason to defend, and in which specific violent incidents, including the one that hardened Blackfeet hostility toward American trappers for years afterward, were frequently set in motion by actions taken by the trapping parties and expeditions themselves, rather than by unprovoked native aggression. None of this erases the genuine danger trappers faced, danger that was entirely real and that this history has already spent considerable time honouring honestly. But an accurate telling has to hold both truths at once, that the danger was real and that it existed substantially because American trappers were operating uninvited and often destructively inside territory and resource systems that belonged by any reasonable measure to someone else first. Even the more admirable, better documented figures of this era carry their own layer of retrospective myth-making worth examining honestly. The trapper who survived that devastating grizzly attack and crawled some 200 miles to safety, whose story this account has already told in some detail, is a genuine, well-corroborated case of extraordinary human endurance. And yet the specific details of that story as they exist in popular retelling today, including certain dramatic elements about confrontation and revenge, that circulate widely in modern film and television versions of the tale, extend considerably beyond what the earliest and most reliable surviving accounts actually support. What survives suggests a man who by most contemporary versions chose not to pursue violent retribution against those who left him for dead, a detail that later, more dramatically satisfying retellings have sometimes altered or omitted entirely in favour of a more conventional revenge narrative that audiences apparently find more satisfying than the quieter, more morally complicated reality. What accounts for this pattern repeating itself across so many individual stories from this era, in which the documented reality is consistently flattened, simplified and reshaped toward whatever version serves the storytelling needs of a later audience? It is not unique to the Mountain Man era by any means. Nearly every popular historical myth undergoes some version of this same process, but this particular chapter of American history offers an unusually clear case study, partly because the original documentary record was already so thin to begin with, leaving considerable open space for later imagination to fill, and partly because the westward expansion this era fed directly into carried such enormous cultural and political weight for the nation that inherited and retold it, weight that made a simplified heroic version of this story considerably more useful for generations of American audiences than the more complicated truth. None of this is offered to diminish what these men actually endured, because that endurance, as this account has tried to show plainly across everything that came before, this was entirely real, verified, across multiple independent lines of evidence ledgers and journals and physical remains and archaeological survey alike. The frostbite was real, the starvation was real, the grisly attacks, the isolation, the brutal calculus of a body slowly failing through a 5-month winter. All of it happened to real men whose names in a great many cases we do not even know with certainty. What deserves correction is not the scale of the hardship, but the shape of the story built around it afterward, a shape that in flattening these men into simple heroic archetypes has often quietly erased the genuinely more interesting and more human reality underneath a reality built on interdependence rather than pure solitude, on complicated moral terrain rather than simple heroism, and on a frontier that was shared however unevenly and however violently rather than empty and waiting to be conquered by one kind of man alone. Because once this trade began to collapse, and it did collapse faster and more completely than almost anyone living through its peak years could have predicted what happened to these men afterward. The ones who survived their winters and their bears and their isolation, only to watch the entire economic foundation of their way of life disappear from beneath them. Within the span of a single decade turns out to be a story that popular memory has told even less accurately, and even less completely than anything that came before it. The final rendezvous. When it finally arrives in the summer of 1840, carries almost none of the celebratory energy that marked those first gatherings on the Green River 15 years earlier, and the men present that season, whether or not they fully understand it yet, are participating in the quiet, unceremonious end of something that once seemed as permanent as the mountains themselves. The cause, when historians trace it back, turns out to be almost entirely disconnected from anything that happened in these mountains at all. In the fashion centres of Europe, silk has by this point thoroughly displaced beaver felt as the material of choice for gentlemen's hats, driven by a combination of shifting taste and a steady supply of Chinese silk becoming more available and more affordable to European manufacturers than it had been in previous decades. It is a change that has nothing to do with trapping skill, nothing to do with the depleted beaver populations that companies have already been struggling against for years. Nothing to do with any of the genuine hardship these men have endured to keep the supply chain running. It is simply that a wealthy man in London choosing a hat in 1840 increasingly prefers the particular sheen and lightness of silk over the heavier, duller felt that beaver fur produces, and that single shift in taste multiplied across thousands of individual purchasing decisions made by people who will never once think about where their previous hats came from is enough to collapse an entire economic system stretching across an entire continent. The speed of the collapse, once it truly begins, genuinely startles even the men running the fur companies themselves. Prices for beaver pelts, which had already been softening for several years under the combined pressure of over-trapping and mounting competition, fall further and faster than almost anyone predicted, dropping to a fraction of what they commanded at the trade's peak barely a decade earlier. Company after company, having built their entire business model around a demand that seemed throughout the 1820s and 30s essentially permanent, find themselves holding warehouses of increasingly worthless fur and extending credit to trappers whose furs, by the time they finally reach market, are worth barely enough to cover the debt those same trappers already owe for the previous season's supplies. It is worth pausing honestly on how quickly an entire way of life, one that had shaped the identity and daily existence of thousands of men across an entire generation, essentially evaporates within the span of a handful of years, a reminder that even the most seemingly solid economic foundations can rest on demand far more fragile and far more distant from the actual labour and hardship involved than anyone doing that labour ever fully realises while they are living inside it. What happens next to the men themselves is a story that popular memory, so preoccupied with the dramatic peak years of this trade, has told far less completely than it deserves. There was no single dramatic ending, no final battle or catastrophic winter that closed this chapter all at once. Instead, the mountain man way of life dissolves gradually and unevenly across the 1840s. Different men, finding different paths forward as the trade that had defined their adult lives simply stops offering a viable living. A number of the more prominent trappers' men who had spent years building genuine expertise in this terrain find that their most valuable asset was never really the fur itself, but the knowledge accumulated in acquiring it. As American settlement pressure builds through the 1840s, driven by economic hardship in the East and by a growing cultural conviction that the nation's destiny lay in expanding across the entire continent, a new demand emerges for exactly the kind of expertise these former trappers possess: not fur but safe passage. Wagon trains carrying entire families westward toward Oregon and California need guides who actually know these mountains, who understand which passes remain viable at which times of year, who can read weather and terrain well enough to keep hundreds of inexperienced travelers alive across thousands of miles of genuinely dangerous country. Most skilled former trappers transitioned directly into this work, becoming some of the most sought after and highly compensated wagon train guides of the following decades, their hard-won mountain knowledge finding an entirely new market just as their original trade collapsed beneath them. The trading post system these men helped establish during the fur trade years also takes on new purpose during this transition. A post originally built to serve the annual rendezvous trade finds itself within a few short years repositioned as an essential waypoint for the growing stream of wagon trains crossing the continent. Its owner, adapting an entire business model built around fur trading into one built around resupplying settlers, a pivot that several former fur trading operations managed successfully enough to remain economically viable for decades after the beaver trade itself has essentially ceased to exist as a meaningful industry. Not every man found so smooth a path forward, and an honest account of this history has to sit with that reality directly, rather than smoothing past it toward a more comfortable narrative. A significant number of former trappers, particularly the less prominent among them, men whose names never made it into any surviving journal or later memoir, simply vanish from the historical record at exactly this point, and what became of them afterward remains genuinely uncertain in a great many individual cases. Some almost certainly drifted into other forms of frontier labor hunting. Buffalo hides for the emerging market in that commodity, working as laborers at the trading posts and forts that continued operating along the major overland routes or taking up subsistence trapping and hunting on a much smaller, more modest scale, simply to survive rather than to profit. Others, according to the scattered evidence that does survive, struggled considerably with the transition men who had built their entire adult identity around a specific, demanding, genuinely respected skill set that the changing economy of the 1840s increasingly had no real use for. Company records from this period occasionally note former trappers falling into debt, into alcohol dependency, into a kind of drifting instability that several later observers, writing with the particular judgment common to their era, attributed to a supposed inability of these men to adjust to more conventional settled life after years spent in the mountains, though a more generous and probably more accurate reading might simply recognize this as an entirely understandable human response to watching an entire skilled profession and the identity built around it disappear within the span of a single decade. There is a genuinely poignant detail buried in the record here that deserves to be told with the care it warrants. Several of the men who had married into native families during their trapping years, unions that had often proven genuinely lasting and meaningful across years or even decades, found themselves navigating an increasingly hostile and complicated racial landscape as American settlement pressure intensified through the 1840s and beyond. The same frontier that had, during the fur trade era, allowed and even encouraged intermarriage and genuine cross-cultural partnership as simply a practical necessity of the trade, grew considerably less tolerant of such arrangements as growing numbers of American settlers arrived, carrying with them the more rigid racial attitudes prevalent in the eastern United States. Some of these families relocated, choosing to live within native communities rather than the encroaching settler society. Others faced discrimination and legal complications that the earlier rendezvous era had simply never required them to confront. The historical record on exactly how many of these mixed families successfully navigated this transition versus how many were torn apart by it remains genuinely incomplete. Since this particular thread of the story received relatively little documented attention from the primarily white American writers and historians who compiled most of the surviving accounts of this era in the decades that followed. What of the beaver themselves, the animal whose fur set this entire chapter of history into motion in the first place? Here at least the story offers something closer to a genuine if slow recovery. With trapping pressure dramatically reduced once the economic incentive disappeared, beaver populations across the Rocky Mountain region began a gradual rebound that would continue with considerable regional variation across the following century. Though full restoration to anything resembling pre-trapping population density would take considerably longer than most people today probably assume, and in certain specific watersheds, some biologists and wildlife historians, when studying this recovery, still debate whether populations have ever truly returned to their original historical baseline, given how significantly the surrounding landscape and ecosystem changed during the intervening decades of broader American settlement and land use. The rendezvous system itself, that remarkable improvised institution that had briefly gathered hundreds of men from wildly different backgrounds and nations into a shared temporary community, each summer simply stops happening after 1840, and its disappearance carries a particular kind of quiet weight worth sitting with. For 15 years, this gathering had represented something genuinely unusual in American history, a meeting ground where American trappers, French-Canadian voyageurs, British traders, and representatives of numerous native nations came together, however imperfectly, and however shaped by unequal power and genuine exploitation on the part of the trading companies in a shared economic and social space that simply had no real equivalent anywhere else on the continent at that particular moment. Its ending was not mourned with any great ceremony by the wider American public, most of whom had never attended one, and knew it only through increasingly romanticized second-hand accounts. But for the relatively small number of men who had actually lived through those summer gatherings, who had raced horses and traded furs and reunited with old companions across all those Green River summers, something genuinely irreplaceable closed with the final rendezvous, a particular form of frontier community that would never exist again in quite that shape. It raises a question worth sitting with honestly, one that applies well beyond this specific chapter of history. What does a society actually owe the men whose labour built an entire profitable industry once that industry no longer needs them? The fur companies that profited enormously from these men's endurance, across nearly 2 decades, offered, in the vast majority of documented cases, essentially nothing in the way of ongoing support once the trade collapsed. No pension, no formal transition assistance, simply a final settling of accounts and a quiet withdrawal of the company's presence from the mountains these men had spent years risking their lives within. It is a pattern that repeats itself across countless other industries and eras. Throughout history, workers whose sustained hardship generates real profit for others, only to be left largely to their own resources once that profit dries up, and the Mountain Man era, for all its particular romance and drama, is in this specific respect a fairly ordinary example of a considerably older and more persistent pattern in how labour and capital have historically related to one another. By the close of the 1840s, the era that this account has spent so much time inhabiting has essentially ended, not with the dramatic final confrontation that popular imagination might prefer, but with the quiet, almost anticlimactic reality of an economic system simply running out of demand. The men who lived through its peak years scatter into new lives, new professions, in some cases, new identities entirely carrying with them scarred hands, missing fingers, memories of grisly encounters and hard winters and rendezvous summers that the rest of the country would spend the following century turning into legend, largely without much concern for how accurately that legend reflected what these men had actually experienced. And yet something of what these men built and something of what they endured did not simply vanish along with the trade itself. The trails they cut through passes no map previously recorded became the very roots that carried an entire nation's westward expansion in the decades that followed. The knowledge they accumulated, often at the cost of frostbitten fingers and near-fatal encounters, shaped how an entire generation of American settlers understood and eventually moved through a landscape that had once been almost entirely unknown to anyone outside the native nations who had lived there for countless generations before any trapper first waded into these particular streams. What began as an improvised, often desperate scramble for a fashionable hat material left behind something considerably more lasting than any fur ever could, a body of hard-won geographic and survival knowledge that quietly permanently reshaped the trajectory of an entire continent long after the last beaver pelt from these particular mountains had been sold, processed, and worn by a gentleman in a city who almost certainly never once wondered what it had actually cost to bring it to him. Drive through the modern American West today, and the fur trade era that ended so quietly in the 1840s turns out to be considerably less gone than that quiet ending might suggest, embedded instead into the actual physical and cultural landscape in ways so thoroughly absorbed into ordinary life that most people moving through them never pause to notice the connection at all. Start with something as basic as movement itself, the actual roads and routes that carry people across this landscape now. A remarkable number of major highways and rail lines through the Rocky Mountain region follow with only modest modern engineering adjustments, the exact same passes and river corridors that trapping brigades identified nearly 2 centuries ago while searching for beaver rather than efficient transportation routes. The gentle mountain pass that trappers used as a practical shortcut between trapping grounds and that later carried tens of thousands of covered wagons westward, now carries a modern interstate highway along essentially the same natural corridor drivers crossing the continental divide today, largely unaware that the route beneath their wheels was first identified and proven viable by men whose actual goal had nothing to do with future highway engineering at all. It is a strange kind of quiet immortality. This pattern geography discovered, for one entirely practical and temporary purpose, ending up permanently woven into the infrastructure of an entire nation. Place names offer another layer of this same quiet persistence scattered across the map in a density that becomes genuinely striking once you start actually looking for it. Rivers, mountain passes, entire towns and counties across Wyoming, Montana, Utah, and Colorado carry the names of trappers and traders whose actual documented lives, when you go looking for the historical record behind the name on the map, often amount to little more than a handful of ledger entries and a single dramatic incident that happened to get written down. A man might spend his entire adult working life doing the grinding and glamorous labour this history has already described in considerable detail, only to be remembered, if he is remembered at all, because his name happened to get attached to a particular bend in a particular river by a surveyor working decades after his death, a form of accidental immortality that has very little to do with what that man actually accomplished or endured while he was alive. The trading posts themselves offer a more deliberate and considerably more visitable form of legacy. Several sites that once served as the beating commercial heart of this trade have been preserved, reconstructed, or in some cases continuously operated in some form across the nearly 2 centuries since now functioning as historical sites. National monuments or living history museums where visitors can walk through reconstructed trading rooms and imagine, with whatever accuracy the reconstruction actually manages to achieve, the crowded, chaotic commerce that once happened on that exact ground each summer. It is worth noting honestly that these reconstructions, however carefully researched, necessarily smooth and sanitize a great deal of the actual physical reality. This account has already described the cell, the grime, the underlying desperation of men whose entire year's livelihood depended on the trades happening within those walls. All of it inevitably softened into something considerably more comfortable for a modern visitor to walk through on a pleasant afternoon than the original ever actually was. Beyond the physical landscape, something less tangible but arguably more significant survives in the cultural relationship that a considerable portion of the modern American West still holds with wilderness itself, an inherited set of values around self-reliance, physical endurance, and a particular kind of respectful familiarity with genuinely dangerous natural landscape that traces its cultural lineage, whether consciously acknowledged or not, directly back to this era. The outdoor recreation industry that now represents a genuinely significant portion of the economy in states like Wyoming and Montana, guides leading backcountry expeditions, outfitters supplying modern wilderness travelers, an entire cultural apparatus built around teaching people how to move safely and competently through mountain terrain, exists in a kind of unacknowledged conversation with the original mountain men, borrowing their imagery, their vocabulary, and in some genuine cases their actual accumulated practical knowledge, even as the actual economic and physical stakes involved have changed almost beyond recognition. A modern backcountry guide leading a well-equipped group with satellite communication and modern medical evacuation available within hours faces genuine risk, certainly, but a version of risk that the original trapper days or weeks from any possible help of any kind would likely find almost unrecognizably softened. There is a particular and genuinely surprising thread of this legacy worth sitting with directly because it complicates any simple story about this history, simply fading gently into nostalgic tourism. Some of the actual descendants of the mixed native and trapper families formed during the rendezvous era are alive today, carrying forward oral traditions and family histories that exist almost entirely outside the written, documentary record this account has already discussed at length. Several native nations across the Rocky Mountain region maintain their own distinct and considerably more complicated understanding of this era, than the version preserved in company ledgers and trapper journals, an understanding passed down through generations within these communities themselves, rather than recorded in any archive a historian working from written sources alone would naturally encounter. In recent decades, growing collaborative work between academic historians and tribal historians and knowledge keepers has begun to meaningfully enrich, and in some specific documented cases genuinely correct the historical record that generations of earlier predominantly non-native historians compiled largely from company and trapper sources alone. What emerges from this ongoing collaborative work is not a simple replacement of one narrative with another, but something considerably richer, a fuller picture built from multiple distinct lines of evidence and memory that taken together offer a version of this history closer to what actually happened than any single perspective could achieve alone. What does it actually mean, one might reasonably ask, for a historical era this brief, less than 2 full decades from the first rendezvous to the last, to leave behind a legacy this disproportionately large relative to its actual duration? Part of the answer likely lies in timing itself. This particular chapter of American history happened to occur at precisely the moment when the young United States was actively constructing its own national mythology, searching for stories that could give a still-forming country a sense of distinctive character and historical depth to rival the older nations of Europe. The Mountain Man, whatever the considerable gap between the documented reality and the eventual popular myth, offered exactly the kind of raw material that mythology needed, a figure of genuine hardship and endurance operating at the literal edge of the known world, available to be shaped into whatever national story a growing country needed to tell itself about its own character and destiny. The beaver hat itself, the small, almost absurd original engine that set this entire chapter of history into motion, has its own quiet, ironic afterlife worth a final mention here. It fell so completely out of fashion following the shift towards silk that most people today encountering a genuine antique beaver felt hat in a museum collection have no immediate sense at all of the vast continent-spanning economic and human system that particular object once represented. An entire brutal and remarkable chapter of American history compressed almost comically into an object now valued primarily as a curious fashion antique rather than understood as the actual mechanism that once drove thousands of men into some of the most dangerous conditions the American landscape had to offer. What remains in the end, once the highways and place names and preserved trading posts and inherited outdoor culture are all accounted for, is something considerably harder to point to directly, but no less real for being intangible, a particular understanding still present in how the American West thinks about itself, of what it actually costs a human being to genuinely know and survive inside a landscape this demanding and understanding first paid for in the most literal and physical sense, by ordinary men wading into freezing streams before dawn in pursuit of an animal whose fur would eventually sit transformed and unrecognizable on the head of someone who would never once think to wonder what it had cost to bring it to him. And now, with the trade itself long ended, the trails grown over or paved beneath modern highways, and the last of the men who actually lived this life gone from the world for well over a century, what remains is simply the story itself and the particular quiet weight of trying to understand honestly and without exaggeration in either direction what it actually meant to be one of these men, in one of these winters in mountains that never once cared whether he survived them or not. There is a particular kind of document historians of this era return to again and again, not because it is dramatic, but because of exactly the opposite quality, its almost unbearable plainness, and it belongs to a man whose name appears in the company ledgers for several consecutive seasons and then quite suddenly stops appearing at all. There is no dramatic final entry, no account of a grisly attack, no note of a battle, no last letter home describing his final thoughts. There is simply a line in the company's book written in the careful, practical hand of a clerk who had never met the man, and was recording only what business required him to record, noting that this trapper's outstanding debt for the season had been written off as uncollectible, the phrase used by the company for a man who was not coming back to settle his account. That is the entire surviving record of how his story ended, a debt closed, nothing more. It would be easy to find that unbearably sad, and in a sense it is. But sitting with it a little longer, something else becomes visible too, something that reaches well beyond this one man and this one ledger entry, and it is worth pausing here to look at it directly before this story closes. Because what this entire history has actually been about underneath the beaver pelts and the rendezvous gatherings and the grisly attacks and the slow economic collapse that ended it all is a question that has nothing specifically to do with mountains or fur trading at all. It is the question of what an ordinary human being is actually capable of enduring when circumstance leaves no other option, and what that endurance is ultimately worth, both to the person living through it and to everyone who comes after. These men were not exceptional before they came west. That is worth saying plainly one more time, because it is the single most important thing this history has to offer, and it is easy to lose sight of it beneath all the drama of any individual story. They were younger sons with no inheritance. They were immigrants looking for the next version of a gamble they had already made once. They were men running from debts, from grief, from lives that had not worked out the way they hoped. Men who answered a newspaper advertisement because it offered something, anything better than what they already had. And then the mountains asked more of them than almost any of them could have imagined possible when they first signed their names to that agreement. And a great many of them found somewhere inside themselves the capacity to meet that demand anyway. Not because they were born different from other people, because the alternative was simply not surviving, and something in human beings tested against genuinely. No other option tends to discover reserves of endurance that comfort and safety never require us to find. This is not a uniquely American story, whatever the particular details of beaver hats and rendezvous gatherings might suggest. It is one specific chapter in a pattern that repeats itself across nearly every era and every culture history has ever recorded. Ordinary people placed by circumstance into conditions of extraordinary hardship, finding within themselves a strength that surprises even them. The specific mountains change. The specific dangers change, but the underlying human truth that we are frequently capable of enduring far more than we believe ourselves capable of until we are actually required to appears again and again in stories separated by continents and centuries, all of them variations on the same essential discovery about what a person can survive when survival is the only option left. And there is something else worth carrying forward from this particular history. Something about power and permanence that reaches well beyond the specific fate of the fur trade itself, an entire industry one that shaped the lives and deaths of thousands of men across 2 decades, that reshaped the map of an entire continent that seemed to the men living inside it as permanent and unshakable as the mountains that hosted it, collapsed within the span of a single decade because wealthy men in London and Paris developed a preference for a different kind of hat. Not because of any failure of skill or courage on the part of the men doing the actual dangerous work. Not because the beaver disappeared entirely, though their numbers had certainly thinned. Simply because fashion changed quietly, thousands of miles away in rooms none of these trappers would ever enter or even see. It is a humbling thing to sit with. How much of what feels permanent and solid to the people living inside a particular moment in history is in fact entirely dependent on forces far outside their control or even their awareness, and how quickly those forces can shift and take everything down with them. What survived in the end was not the trade itself, and not really the wealth it generated, most of which flowed to company owners and investors who mostly never set foot in the mountains at all. What survived was knowledge, trails, names on a map, a particular relationship with wild, demanding landscape that would eventually become woven into the identity of an entire region of the country. And perhaps most quietly and most movingly, a small number of families formed across cultural lines that the era both required and later made increasingly difficult to sustain, whose descendants carry pieces of this history forward today in ways that no company ledger or trapper journal ever fully anticipated or recorded. There is one final piece of evidence worth mentioning. Before this story closes, a small thing easy to overlook, but somehow more affecting than almost anything else this account has described. Among the physical artifacts recovered from the site of one of the major rendezvous gatherings, alongside the trade beads and gun parts and broken glass that make up most of what archaeology typically recovers from a place like this, researchers found a small collection of children's items. Tiny moccasins are carved wooden toys small enough to fit inside a single closed hand. Nothing about them is dramatic. Nothing about them made any newspaper then or since, but they mean something worth sitting with quietly for a moment. Even here in the roughest, most dangerous, most temporary community imaginable, in a valley that existed as a functioning settlement for only a few weeks each year, before scattering entirely, there were children. There was ordinary family life, however brief and however unusual its circumstances, happening alongside the trading and the drinking and the horse racing that history tends to remember more readily. There was, in other words, simply life doing what life does everywhere, finding its way forward even inside conditions that seem from the outside almost impossible. Possibly harsh for it to take root at all. That perhaps is the truest thing this whole story has to offer. Because history, when you spend enough time with it, tends to teach the same lesson again and again, in different costumes, in different centuries, in different corners of the world. Power rises and it feels permanent while it lasts, and then it falls, usually for reasons the people living inside it never fully see coming. Empires end, trades collapse. Entire ways of life that seemed as fixed and unshakable as the mountains themselves quietly fade sometimes within a single generation, until what remains is only a name on a map, an old ledger entry, a handful of stories retold imperfectly by people who were not there. And underneath all of that, rising and falling quietly, persistently, the ordinary human beings living through it simply keep going. They build small fires and keep them burning through impossible nights. They make families in impossible circumstances. They carve small wooden toys for children, even when their own survival remains genuinely uncertain from one season to the next. They endure winters that should by any reasonable measure have ended them, and a great many of them, against real odds, come out the other side still breathing, still walking, still somehow finding a way forward into whatever comes next. This is not a story about mountain men, not really. Not anymore at this distance. It is a story about what it means to be a person placed inside conditions that ask more of you than you ever believed you had to give, and finding somewhere in the cold and the dark and the uncertainty that you had more to give than you knew. Let the mountains fall quiet now. Let the Rendezvous Valley empty the way it always did each August, wagons turning east, brigades scattering back into passes that would soon fill with snow. Let the fires burn down slowly, the way a good fire always does, embers holding their warmth long after the flame itself has gone. Somewhere in that valley 2 centuries ago, a man once sat through a night so cold that survival itself became the only thing that mattered. One small fire, one breath at a time, 1 hour carried carefully into the next. He did not know sitting there whether history would remember him. Most of them in the end it did not. But he built the fire anyway, and kept it burning anyway, and somewhere in the quiet after, in the long silence that settled over those mountains once the trade was gone and the men were gone, and even the beaver had slowly begun at their own patient pace to return to the streams that had once nearly emptied of them entirely, something of that small, stubborn act of endurance remained, not loud, not remembered by name in most cases, Just present the way certain things simply are quietly folded into the land itself, into the shape of a mountain pass into a river, with a trapper's name still attached to it, into the deep, undisturbed silence of a winter night in the high country where snow still falls now exactly as it fell, then indifferent, patient, and utterly unaware that it once asked so much of the men who tried to survive beneath it. The fire is long out now. The valley is quiet, and somewhere still the snow keeps falling,